Hello and welcome to Redaction Report for our April live show. Now, just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. This show is going out slightly earlier in the month because I'm about to be away for a couple of weeks. Don't worry, Redaction Report is still going to be taking over. There's still going to be plenty of great content out on the site that we've got planned for you. So please, redactionpolitics.com, keep an eye out there. And there'll be clips of the show on YouTube in due course. So please keep an eye out for everything that we've got going. Please also remember that we are fundraising for Ukraine. We're doing a fundraiser for Save the Children. There will be a link in the description. We're also putting out a limited series podcast on Ukrainian history. You can find that here on youtube.com. Follow into our profile. You'll be able to find the first episode there. It's all in support of Save the Children. Really great work they're doing in Ukraine to help child refugees. So please donate what you can to support them. So today is Sunday, the 10th of April. We're recording this in the evening. The exit poll for the French presidential election has been released. And it looks like we're up for a rematch. It's going to be, if the exit polls are correct, it's going to be a rematch from 2017 of Emmanuel Macron versus Marine Le Pen in round 2. So a bit of background for listeners not in the know. How the French presidential elections work is that all the candidates will be on the ballot in a first round where everyone will vote for the candidate of their choice. And then the two candidates that get the most votes will advance to a runoff a couple of weeks later. And voters will go back to the polls again, and they'll vote for one of those final two. Now, in 2017, those final two were Emmanuel Macron, widely regarded as a centrist candidate, more often characterized since he's been in president as centre-right, against the far-right candidate Marine Le Pen of what was then the French National Front. It's now called the National Rally. And it looks like this runoff is going to happen again. Of course, Macron won that election. He's seeking re-election, and his old rival seems to be, assuming the exit polls are correct, up against him again. I'm joined by our good friend Tom Judge, who's here to help us unpack all of this. Tom, how's it going?
I'm good, thank you. Reeling, it's turned out to be a lot more interesting than what we thought a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago. It's actually looked like a sort of boring election. Macron was doing very well. He had very good approval ratings for a president at this point in his tenure. He was polling very well, very far ahead of Le Pen. And then in the last few weeks, it narrowed up very significantly. Still is narrowed up, of course, when you look at the second round polling. And now the exit poll results, obviously we don't know for certain if this is going to be what the results are by tomorrow morning. Prove very interesting. It's not one that's done. I think it might have been. It was a slightly foregone conclusion that this would be the top two, I think, for the last couple of weeks. But yeah, a very interesting exit poll, and it will prove to be a very interesting set of results if it comes to pass.
It's an interesting qualification that you make for the last couple of weeks, because of course, for the past year or so, there's been talk about who will be up against Macron. Because for a long while, it was assumed that it would be Marine Le Pen again.
Yeah.
But then Eric Zemmour, far-right pundit, but he has been running for president. It looked at one point like he was on the rise, but according to the France Television Ipsos exit poll, it looks like he's only set to get 7.2% of the vote.
Yeah.
For context, Macron, according to this exit poll, is set to get 28.1%. Marine Le Pen, 23.3%. Leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon getting 20.1%, and then Zemmour in fourth place there. Now, interestingly, the two main parties, historically at this point, I think it's fair to say historically now, the two major parties in France, the Socialist Party and what is today called the Republicans, Les Républicains, but has gone through several rebrandings. It used to be UMP, are both scoring very poorly.
Yeah.
What do we make of this?
Becresse actually had a moment. There was a while where she was being polled. There were, prospective polls if she was going to make the second round. When she won the nomination, she looked likely to. Well, there was a point where she was polling very well, but now she's on 5% in this poll. In some polls, she's below even the Green candidate. So we'll see how that turns out. Obviously, by tomorrow morning. But I think, yeah, the both parties are dying, if not, down for the moment. I mean, we'll see. Parties can always return, can't they? But they're just electorally insignificant in this year, and they're always going to be to a certain extent, because that's always the thing in French politics. Losing once doesn't mean that you're gone. We don't really do it here, where if you lose a general election, or if at least you don't gain significantly in a general election, you don't really get another go. Whereas Le Pen, this is her third presidential run, and it's Mélenchon's third presidential run as well, that you get to keep going.
And it's worth pointing out some context there that has happened for previous presidents. Francois Mitterrand took a couple of goes before he was elected, as did Jacques Chirac. So it's nothing new for presidential candidates to have a couple of losses before they take up their seat in the Élysée Palace.
No, of course not. But to a certain extent, this is what has allowed Le Pen and Mélenchon to kind of rise, because all three of the top candidates have done better in the first round of voting, if this poll proves to be true, than they did in the last one. And Mélenchon and Le Pen have both just improved time and time, twice, 3 times now, or twice now, I suppose they've improved. Whereas the traditional parties are just completely gone. It speaks to something that's been true for a long time now, is that people are just fed up with traditional politics as they see it. And in France's case, with a system like this one, they actually have the ability to kick out traditional parties. We don't really have that option. Americans don't really have that option, as another example, but in France they can do that. It's a very visceral example of how when people want to do that, they can do it. And is this the future now? Are these the 3 parties that will continuously dominate French politics? I mean, we'll see.
We will see. Obviously, in the wake of the 2017 presidential election, Macron's party, La République En Marche, stormed to victory in the French Parliament, while La France Insoumise, Mélenchon's party, and the National, what was then the National Front, only scored a handful of seats, despite strong showings for their presidential candidates. So what happens for the presidential election may or may not be reflected in what happens in the French Parliament too. Mm-hmm. But like you point out, those 2 main parties seem to be stagnating. Now, it's worth pointing out that last time round, the French Socialist Party collapsed, yes. Benoît Hamon, even though he was widely seen as more of a left-winger in the Socialist Party, he was overshadowed by Mélenchon back in 2017 too. Despite that, François Fillon, who at one point was the favorite to win in 2017 before the Penelope Gate scandal, still pulled off a good showing in 2017. The Republicans still came third then with around 20% of the vote. And now, by the looks of this exit poll, they're suffering much the same fate as befell the socialists last time. So it's an interesting field we're looking at for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, obviously, there are term limits in France. And I'm assuming we'll go on to discuss the second round shortly, but even if Macron does win this, there will be no incumbent come the next election in 5 years. We're talking a long time, obviously. But then potentially, then who knows where that because Macron is the party, he is that part of politics. So when he departs, maybe one of these parties will have room to rise again. So parties like this, they're down now, but there's always room to regrow. Especially, like say, a system like this.
Of course, it's arguably one of the problems of the system like this is that it just becomes about the individual, not about the party, not about the principle, not about the policy. If you're voting for a president, not for a party. So what happens in 2027? Like you say, is an open field. One point to raise, though, is that in France, unlike in the US, being the incumbent isn't necessarily an advantage. The French tend to hate their politicians. And Macron's approval ratings, by US standards, are low. But relatively speaking, his approval ratings have been respectable by the standards of previous French presidents, certainly compared to his predecessor, Francois Hollande, who notoriously left office with abysmal approval ratings, so abysmal, in fact, that he didn't seek re-election, even though he was eligible for it. To that end, given that French incumbents often don't get re-elected, such as Sarkozy, such as Hollande, well, he didn't stand again, that's probably where Marine Le Pen may be in his advantage when it comes to round two, in that she's up against an incumbent. She can just project onto the incumbent and say, he's the cause of all your problems, I'm the solution. When you're not up against Hollande, when you're up against another new fresh face who says, I'm the solution to your problems, then it's slightly harder to sell that message. And of course, Le Pen, the previous time, was kind of a joke when it actually came to debating Macron. She clearly demonstrated considerable policy illiteracy. And that put a lot of potential swing voters off of Le Pen. This time round, she's run a much savvier campaign, I feel. She's focusing very much on bread and butter issues, cost of living crisis. That's what she's hammering home. She's not going on about the EU. She's not, last I checked, she's not even advocating for Frexit anymore.
No.
So she's toned down her rhetoric a lot. And to that end, she's almost had Eric Zemmour to thank. Because if anyone in our country will know, if you hark back to the Brexit referendum, there were actually two Leave campaigns. There was the Vote Leave campaign and the Leave.eu campaign. Now, there was the official Vote Leave campaign that was seen as the more respectable face of the Leave campaign. And then you had Leave.eu that was Nigel Farage and buddies doing what I was about to say do best, but that's giving them way too much credit. But, and you could argue that same dynamics at play here with Le Pen and Zemmour. Zemmour seen as far more extreme right than even Le Pen, making Le Pen seem moderate by comparison.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, actually, because Zemmour is there. I think he said at one point that he wanted to create like a ministry for deportation and deport around 100,000 people a year. And when, the candidate that was previously branded as, the far right candidate can denounce somebody else as far too extreme, that makes her look very good. And she has moved somewhat more to the center right, rather than the far right. I mean, she's obviously still on the far right, but she's softened ever so slightly.
She's softened her rhetoric. Is the bottom line.
And there is a cost of living crisis happening in France as well, and she's been able to, I think, harness some of the energy around that. But then it's not as bad as in a lot of it's about, I think their inflation rate's about 5%. So it's not as bad as what it has been in a lot of countries, but it's still significant. So she's captured a lot of energy around that. That I think it's very hard for the incumbent to be able to capture energy about, because, you know, if there's a crisis, which is obviously not Macron's, this is, you know, a pan-European problem, but, you know, as the incumbent, he's seen as responsible for it to a certain extent, so he can't really capture that energy to the same extent that she can. And she's pivoted away from talking about the EU and just talking about foreign policy in general, as and that's worked to her benefit a lot. And I think with the collapse of Patrice as well, she's moved into that space a little bit, but I think Macron has maybe actually gone into that space a lot more as well. 28% was, if this exit poll proves to be true, will actually be quite good in comparison to what polling was suggesting. And I think maybe that's where the ground that he's moved into a little bit. As has been noted, he was a centrist in 2017, and I think most would say he has governed on the centre right and is now running on the centre right. And that's where it is. Of course, now the real question is where's the rest of the vote going to go? Mélenchon had come in a strong third place. Not many expected him to do better than what he did in 2017. And by the looks of it,
frankly, most people expected him to do worse. He was polling abysmally for quite a long time.
Much worse. The fact that he's even done it will only be about a percentage point better, but the fact that he's even done that is shocking to most. Now, where those votes go now is very crucial, and it's third by a long way as well. Where it was more of a sliding scale in 2017, down from the candidates here. There's a clear cutoff after Mélenchon. No one else gets double digits. So where those votes go are crucial, and the endorsements from all the major candidates, I believe, have come in now.
Well, Pécresse has already said she's going to vote for Macron. Mélenchon has said his supporters should not vote for Le Pen, but has not explicitly said they should vote for Macron, which is arguably a crucial distinction. And, you know, even speaking as a leftist is one of the reasons I have reservations about Mélenchon. But it's going to be down to the wire far more than it was in 2017 if the polls are to be believed. 2017, Le Pen stood no chance in the second round. That French electoral system, of that two-round system, inherently disadvantages divisive candidates. Problem is, in France, when incumbents are divisive by nature, what happens then? And if we assume that on the same playing field, all those Zemmour votes go to Le Pen, that's instantly another, just over 7%, assuming the exit poll is correct. Let's say the votes for Nicolas Dupont-Aignan go to Le Pen. Again, that's another, I think that's 1 or 2 percentage points going in there.
2.3.
2.3, there we go. Do we assume that all the further left-wing votes go to Macron, though? Because as we've already said, Macron ran on a fairly big tent campaign in 2017. And that's always the problem of running a big tent campaign. Because at some point, if you get elected on a big tent platform, you've got to pick a direction of travel once you're in government. And you're inevitably going to leave a lot of the people who voted for you feeling like you let them down and feeling like they can't trust you. And where do you go from there if you want to get re-elected?
The Zemmour has endorsed Le Pen, and I think we can expect those votes to almost certainly go to Le Pen.
Like, if you're prepared to vote for Zemmour, you're not going to go, gosh, I voted for Zemmour, but I can't quite stomach Le Pen.
But I think I have seen polling that suggests that she has a high ceiling, or a low ceiling, I should say, sorry, when it comes to people that are prepared to vote for her. because of the divisive. Apparently, 50% of those polled say they could never stomach voting for Le Pen, and you need 50%. So that's not.
You need 50% of people who turn out.
Yeah, you need 50% of people that turn out, of course. So we'll see.
Apathy will be beneficial to Le Pen.
Yes,
if people are prepared to rally around against fascism in the same way that a lot of more progressive Democrats did for Biden against Trump, then Macron might win a second term. I think it's not a perfect analogy. Macron is considerably to the right of Biden.
Yeah.
At the same time, if we're not prepared, if people on the left and people on the center aren't prepared to work together in the face of the far right, we haven't learned the lessons from the 1930s.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's going to be, for a lot of people, if it's going to be turning up and holding your nose, and putting an X in the box for Macron, which isn't a great way to win an election, but it is a way to win an election. So we'll see. There is, of course, the argument that some people make that some Mélenchon voters will switch to Le Pen. It's a minority, but every vote counts. You only need 50% plus one. And if a large amount of those votes don't turn out, and then a certain amount vote for Le Pen, and she gets the more votes, maybe she gets some of the more centre-right candidates' votes. Certainly not impossible.
And time will tell. Tom, thanks for joining.
Thank you.